Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. This is Roy Kessel, your host, and this week we are very excited to have with us Heidi Webb. Heidi is the founder of Kite Fundraising. Heidi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Roy. It's great to be here. I've listened in, I've tuned in, and you've got some great guests, and I'm humbled to be among them.
Well, I know you've done a lot of great work on the fundraising area, and we're going to spend a lot of our time today talking about some of the tips and ideas that you've utilized over the years and what you found to be successful. But I think as the background, let's go through a little bit of how Heidi got to this space and what really made you interested and drawn to this sector.
Very interesting story, actually. If you're ready to sort of sit back and grab your own cup of coffee as you listen in, I found nonprofit by seemingly by accident, but if you believe there's a reason for everything, then my story will make a lot of sense to you. I was in the computer technology industry after I graduated college, and I was making a lot of money. I was working very hard in the 8A minority-owned business world and helping nonprofits get big government contracts. But I wasn't happy, Roy, and I didn't know why. I was young. I didn't have a mentor. I turned to my employer and I said, I don't know what to do. I'm just not, the world seems lackluster to me. And he said, well, you're young, take a hiatus. Why don't you work, one of our nonprofit clients has an opening, a job opening. We had a pro bono client in the mental health industry, and just go meet with him. It either is going to make sense for you or it's not. And that was the best advice I had ever received to that point. And so I met with this executive director. We had a 5-hour conversation. It was just seamless. They were looking for a human resources director. And anyone who knows me and is listening into this podcast is laughing right now, because to imagine me sitting at a desk doing insurance paperwork is quite humorous. It doesn't add up. I'm a people person for sure. So I went on this job interview. I had a great discussion with this gentleman, this executive director, and I said, I could do this job, but is there anything else I can do? Because I'll die of boredom if you sit me in front of a desk and I'm filling out employee paperwork. He just said, well, what do you want to do? We have a newsletter. Do you write? And I said, oh, I love writing. I was an English major. I'll take over your newsletter. And so the relationship began. I started working there. It began with, what can I do? What more can I do? The creative side of me just was thirsty. And so they were a nonprofit in a grant system transitioning to a fee-for-service system. So young or not, inexperienced in the nonprofit space or not, I knew they needed money. So I just started going out and getting it. I didn't ask permission. I started completing grant applications and all of that. So I started with them in January. I had a meeting with this same gentleman in August. So 8 months later, I said, listen, I need new business cards. And he said, sure, I'll sign the business card form that gives you permission to order new business cards. And when he looked at the form, it said Director of Development. So that was the way I asked to transition as their full-time fundraiser. And he stood back, he got a grin on his face and said, in the 30 years I've been doing this work, no one has ever asked for a job the way you just did, but you're hired. And so my first development job was really, my passion and purpose meeting my natural talent to want to serve in that way. And that's, to me, at the root of fundraising is just going in for the ask, leaning in, as they say, and feeling passionate about what it is that you want to do. And of course, from there, I took the necessary classes. I'm now a certified fundraising executive and have been for 5 years. I've taught a number of, I've done training, I've done panel discussions. I'm now an international fundraiser and have been for the past 4 years or so. I just love what I do. I'm filled with enthusiasm for it 21 years later.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground there, and certainly it's an interesting story, as you can imagine. And as you said, in telling the story, there's very few people that get a job as a director of development by just putting their own name on a business card and starting to hand it out. So that's a gutsy move right there. And obviously that shows that you've got the necessary chutzpah for that kind of role, where you can go in there and make the ask, because that's, for many people, that's one of the most challenging parts of fundraising,
Sure,
is how do I go out and try and find a way to uh, make that ask, because many
sure.
people are uncomfortable talking about money, asking for money. And as you know, typically when we work with different boards of directors and go through fundraising training and solicitation training, uh, there's many people on those boards that express discomfort and want to find other ways they can support the fundraising activities without doing the direct heavy lifting of the
Whew,
face-to-face solicitations and things of that
indeed,
nature.
indeed.
Um, and one of the things that I think would be useful for people to understand, you described kind of your education process to fill that role. So tell us a little bit more about what that looked like to get the certified fundraising executive status, and what you went through to accomplish that.
Sure. I avoided doing it for a lot of years. I should share that with you. I did not feel initially that it was necessary because I was doing the work, raising the dollars. I was too busy, let's say, in my mind. But I'm a very knowledge thirsty human in general. So, for example, we're having this conversation at the, you know, I won't say in the middle of, because certainly this started back in December in some parts of the world, but we're in the middle of a crisis situation with COVID-19. And I am, if not daily, certainly weekly, on a number of webinars, and not myself. I'm not the trainer. I'm the student. I'm the willing listener. I want to soak it all in and understand it all. So getting my advanced certification was important because I needed to show that I don't just do, I also am open to learning and having a skill set that, understands the rule book, right? I don't know that I've ever been a rule book kind of gal. And I think that's why I love this space so much. But it is important. There are structures to fundraising. It is not just, hey, I want to raise $1 million. And then I say, okay, why do you want to raise $1 million? And what's your track record for raising funds in general? If they don't have an answer like, well, 23% of our donors are new each year, we're building our base, or we have, X number of donors who are giving, $1,000 or more. If they don't have those specific answers, I realize what I'm dealing with here. Someone who doesn't have a clear understanding of, the fundamentals of fundraising, because there are very technical aspects, as you know, Roy, to fundraising. It's not just the fun stuff. It's not just going in for the ask. I mean, there's a lot of there's a knowledge base that you need to have. And so I went to go get it years after sort of being in the space, and I'm glad I did. I'll tell you, with your CFRE certification, there is a study component. There are aspects of legacy giving and capital campaigns that I think every fundraiser should know. And the really interesting part about the exam, they reserve a slot of hours for you to take this exam, and you take it as quickly, or you go right to the buzzer. And your answers are not necessarily just the right answer. They're the best of several right answers. And so it is not an easy exam to take. You will sweat as you're taking it. I've shared with other colleagues in the field. It is an honor to have those, 4 letters after my name, because I know the work that goes into it. I also feel much more confident in explaining to potential clients, or just people who are sitting in on a class that I might be leading, to say that I know this. I know what goes into the basics, the fundamentals. And we may offshoot here and there just to have a little fun with the field and with the space, but we also need to base our decisions on facts.
Well, what's interesting when you go through that is the challenge is There's so many moving parts to a fundraising program and to a fundraising system. And as you said, you've got a lot of practical experience. Having that professional credential certainly helps because it puts people at ease that you've been through some of the formal training. But we all have been around in every profession, people that have all the formal training in the world, but don't seem to be able to put the pieces together and really help establish and help talk about, how do I make this client comfortable?
Sure.
How can I put a program together and walk them through this process? Because it's not just about telling them what they want to hear, it's about telling them what they need to hear.
That's
And
right.
from our conversations, I think that's one of your strengths, is being able to really push back and say, no, 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 it's not about you're raising $1 million. Tell me what you're doing, because maybe you only need 500,000, maybe you need 5 million. You just
Right.
picked that number,
Right.
and without a better understanding of where that number comes from, I can't help you put together the right kind of campaign. So when you sit
Sure.
down with the client initially, how do you manage that process?
That is a great question. I think what's important, Roy, is I introduce myself as a frontline fundraiser. And the reason that that is important is, regardless of how much my business grows, regardless of how many clients I'm able to support, I am that human who has been on the front line and who will step alongside you to show you the way. Advice is very easy to dole out, regardless of what advice you're giving. And any person with a sense of confidence and a little bit of sales savvy can convince you that they know the right thing and here's what you should do. But until they've done it, and more than once, can they really tell you? Can they really say that that's what you should do? I mean, so I digress. So frontline fundraiser, I think that's important. I think I speak it and I show it and I've lived it and I have a track record. And I think that helps quite a bit. I also empathize with where they're at and I understand it. So I don't want to come in, regardless of someone else's, I have met the most experienced, Roy, I know you know this, and I know your listeners have too, some really highly credentialed, highly educated professionals who are very, very good at what they do, but are deathly afraid of fundraising, deathly afraid. So the first work I really do with a client is I just get them to a space of comfort, right? That we're going to talk about a scary subject. I don't want to go in like a bulldozer. I want to go in with a bit of a soft touch. I want to go in and share knowledge with you and experience to say, hey, I've been there. I may not have gone to Harvard as you have, but I've been in your shoes where that first ask is quite scary. And I won't pretend that it's not. But here are some things that you can do to work yourself up to that ask. So I don't ever throw people into the swimming pool. I think eventually you have to jump in, right? But, even with experienced, knowledgeable board members, I may start them out with, calling major donors to update them on the latest programs from that particular group. I may have them on thank you calls. I may have them on corporate presentation visits there just to observe. Because again, there are different mindsets. You can read the book, I don't know how you are, Roy, and I'd love to know. I'm going to ask you a question now. If you get a big thing, let's call it your child's bunk bed comes in, let's even say from IKEA, where the parts are all, lots of parts. Do you read the instruction manual or does your brain start to put it together before you read the manual?
I can't say that I'm a manual reader by nature. I think that what I do is I kind of look at it and see whether there's going to be steps that I need help with. And so um, most things I think today, at least that come, or at least that I'm able to assemble, aren't the most complex. And so there's usually only a couple of steps where I need help. The ones that come with a true manual and book that you've got to go through, reminds me of a friend of mine that we tried to put together one of those portable basketball rim assemblies and everything. And we spent 2 weekends trying to put this thing together and still didn't even have it halfway done before we called the service to come and do it, because
Oh
there
God.
were, 47 different parts and diagrams and I think the challenge is a little bit different in fundraising, but I think there's some analogy, which is once you go past a certain step, it's really hard to unwind that. So there
That's
were
right.
in that instruction book, like big bold letters, like make sure you've got this step right before you go on, because once you've put these two pieces together, you can't get them apart.
That's a
And
very good analogy there, Roy.
I, I think when you start going into the fundraising area,
Mm-hmm.
um, your communication with every donor is critical. And so building that relationship is a process. It's not something that you just snap your fingers and all of a sudden, yeah, here's the guy writing you a check for $1 million. That's a long-term build and a long-term process. And it kind of reminds me of that game Labyrinth, of where you move in the ball and there's all the little holes that the ball could drop into as you're navigating the course, because anywhere along the way, if there's a misstep from you, Heidi, who's asking for the money, from the organization, uh, from the world, right there's all kinds of potholes along the way that could throw that off course. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's an area that's always very interesting to me when you're working with clients, on how you advise them to handle those challenges.
It's interesting that you say that. I have this memory percolating. It's coming to the top here, and I think it's quite appropriate to where we are in this conversation. I've had people ask me, "Can you show me how to do a major ask? Can we role play?" And certainly, I can give sort of a sampling of how the conversation will go. But when I look back upon six figure and even my first $1 million ask, there was nothing I could have predicted. Obviously, preparing for it, that's different, right? But in terms of, you could be, on stage having a presentation and a spider drops down and you have to keep talking. You could be deathly, you could have, what is that phobia of spiders? You could be deathly afraid of
Arachnophobia.
spiders, but you can't get off track. But I can't predict for you that spider is going to just be in your peripheral and you have to keep going. So I think major gift fundraising is the same way. When I look back at my very first 3-figure gift, it was completely unpredictable.
Does
In
that include the
fact,
decimal points, the 3 figures?
I'm sorry?
Does that include the decimal points to get to the three
No,
figures? No.
no,
Okay,
no,
just
no.
checking.
But it was in 2008. I'm talking individual funder. I'd certainly done grants for lots and lots of money, but my first six-figure gift was actually in 2008. And it was during we remember, right? For those of us who are a little bit old, 2008, it was like I had a client who, an organization I was working with that had a capital campaign that they'd put all this work into it. And do you stop and say, okay, bulldozers, go home? We've done all this work up to here, but no, you have to keep going. And I'll never forget, I was able to get them in the local paper with the shovel in their that shovel picture that we're shovel ready, we're ready to go. And I'm thinking, I cannot believe we're doing this, but we did it. And there's a youth
Cutting
activity
the
center.
ribbon.
We did the ribbon at the end, right? But the shovels in the beginning, but that was the launch of our campaign. Anyway, so the first 6-figure gift leading up to that shovel ready photo op was a gentleman who had absolutely refused to pay his pledge. Absolutely refused. And it was a lot of bringing up, it was a lot of you can get more bees with honey. Is that what more honey? And it was a lot of that. It was a lot of reminding him why his heart connected with that mission and why he needed to make that donation. And when I went to the executive director, who, by the way, was good friends with him and deathly afraid of forcing him to pay his pledge, and I said, he's got to. He's absolutely got to. Well, you go do it. You go make him do it. He won't do it. He won't do it. We're going to lose the money. No, we're not going to lose the money. And we didn't. And we were able to erect this beautiful youth activity center. And my name's on the art room. They said, where do you want your name? You got this building up during an economic downturn. We were going to give you a room. And I said, I want the art room. That's where people create stuff. I like that.
Well, and that raises an interesting point, which is people are afraid of the ask, right? And they're afraid to ask somebody to follow through as well in terms of what goes on. And I think
yes.
one of the difficulties as you look at the process that you go through is the people made a gift because they had a belief in the organization. It's not just some random thought, especially at the magnitude of gift that you're talking about. Somebody put a lot of thought into that. They have a lot of passion in for that organization. Now, you may hit a time of crisis. You may hit a downturn in the market. You may hit a pandemic like we're sitting with now. Nobody knows what's going to happen, but that heartstring is still going to be there. And the question then becomes how you can massage the situation and continue to work with that donor to get it across the finish line. Maybe it's just an adjustment of the time frame and tweaking it in some small way. Maybe it's something else that needs to happen, but very few of the donors are looking to pull their gift for an organization that they made that type of commitment to. I think it's different. We're not dealing with the politics side of things. Now we're dealing with the nonprofit side, and certainly with the organizations that we work with in the sports or social services types of spaces, even if they're done through sports, these are organizations that are helping kids. They're helping individuals who have a disability. They're working with all kinds of services that are important in the community, and the people giving the gifts understand that. They want those services to go on. And I think, as you said, getting them involved and showing them what's going on is critical. I think one of the best pieces of advice from any fundraising training that I ever went to, the individual said, what the eyes don't see, the heart won't feel. And so when you put them in front of what's going on and they see the individuals that are being serviced by a program, their reaction is very different than when Heidi comes in, sitting in a conference room, boardroom. It's a very different feeling and attachment they have when they're actually on site.
Sure. There's something I want to say here too, Roy, that's really important for your listeners. And I've said this before, and it's sort of like I'm having an I told you so moment. And I don't mean that spitefully, but nonprofits have a habit, not all of them, but they have a habit of saying, give today, give now. And they've been doing this for a long time. And I've always said, why are you saying now? Why are you saying today? If you have a really good reason for saying it, as in that if we're dealing with puppy dogs, that puppy dog's going to be euthanized tomorrow. That's a good reason to say today, right? Or that child is entering into foster care and needs a care package. That's a good today. But when you overuse today, now, urgent, they're not going to hear you when it actually is. So one would think now when events are being canceled, when foundations are pulling back, not all of them, but there are some foundations that have completely closed their spring grant cycle, when corporations are pulling back from sponsorships. Now we're in a now. Now we're in a today. But I really feel strongly about this. Clearly, I'm speaking up with a passion because it's important to hear. We all grew up, I hope, hearing about Peter who cried wolf. Let's not do that, nonprofits. Let's be very clear about our expectations and our needs always. But if everything's urgent, then when they are urgent, people won't hear that.
And I think that's the ongoing challenge for every nonprofit, right? It's urgent because for most nonprofits, this is their lifeblood. Every year, we've got to go and raise more and more money, or we've got to raise the same amount of money just to support what we did last year. So we've got to go and fight that battle every year just to get back to ground zero,
Right.
much less raise, as you're talking about in a capital campaign or in a major gifts type of campaign, where you're really trying to use those to expand what the organization is doing, not
That's right.
just to leave it on the same flat track that it's been on. Okay, ho hum, we're going along.
That's
uh
right.
I think the it's very difficult, and I've seen it with lots of groups, where there are emergency situations that come up, right? If you're fundraising for things that are based on geographic issues, where there's violence and there's a greater need because of a war or because of a health scare or a pandemic,
Sure.
there's a very real need to increase the level of services today. Okay,
Sure.
yeah, maybe we raise $50 million every year, but this year we're going to need $75 million because of what's
That's
going on.
right. Sure.
How do you convey that urgency? And so when you counsel them on that, you're absolutely right. But what what can they do? Because it really is urgent. Every year we've got to raise that baseline amount of funding for us to exist. Otherwise, we got to shut our doors or let people go or provide less services. But when there is a crisis, how do you convey like the what I'll call standard urgency, which is what we have every year, compared to the true emergency when there's a crisis?
I think you just answered your own question. Every year is every year. I mean, the thing that I love about nonprofit is if you're doing it right, you are not asking an individual to um, take your car from point A to point B. You are at point A, you're opening your door and saying, hop in, join us. We're going to go to point B together. Is that cool? And you make them a part of your process. And once they're a part of your process, they already know what your annual needs are. They already know that this is a need that you have every year. So what you don't want to do is go to that person that you said, come on in for the ride, and say, it's urgent, it's urgent. I mean, take that to a personal relationship. If I have a 14-year-old boy who is not a morning person like I am. He's, not at all. And so if I, set his alarm and knock on his door and start, start banging things around, you got to get to the school bus, eventually he doesn't hear any of that. It doesn't change the fact he doesn't automatically become a morning person. He doesn't, he may, to avoid all that, he may do some things to better prepare himself. My point is, I've gone off the rails here a little bit. The point is, bring your donors into your storyline. Don't have them viewing it from afar. Bring them in, make them a part of it. And then it's not urgent until it is. And when it is, tell them it's urgent. But again, I do a lot of year-end campaigns. I have a marketing person on my staff. I think fundraising and marketing are a good marriage, right? I think they're good. They work together well. And that's where, year-end fundraising becomes pretty critical for most nonprofits, because if they haven't, it's that time of year when most people, at least here in our country, are giving. But I caution every nonprofit, make a goal for yourself in 2020. Don't say, it's now, it's urgent because we want to meet our goal. No, it's not. They should, your friends, your supporters, the people who we talked about, that gentleman earlier who felt the mission with his heart, they know your need. They know where you need to go. So all I'm talking about here is rhetoric, getting away from the sky is falling until it is.
And I think one of the challenges that we have, as you look at the year-end campaigns in particular, becomes the clutter that's out there. If I look at the days that are allocated for special giving events, or year-end wrap-ups or things like that, right? I'm getting dozens and dozens of emails from every organization in our network and every organization everywhere else saying, we need you now. And I think a big challenge right now is how easy it is for people to get to you. So if you think about before social media or before email, right now that's already going back a ways, but for somebody to have your name, your address, know something about you took a much bigger effort, much bigger process than it is today, where things get blasted out to hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of people fairly
Mm,
easily, fairly inexpensively. And
right.
what I see as a challenge for a lot of the nonprofits is that's great, right? I can send an email out to 100,000 people, but how do I get somebody to open that email, engage with that email? Because that donor that you think would be a great catch for your organization, I can promise you they've got 20 or 50 other similar sounding uh, requests, right? Just like in the time of crisis, how many COVID-19 emails did we get from every organization telling us to wash our hands and do the same things that every other organization is telling us, and that's great for them to show that they're proactive. But when you're doing fundraising, at the end of the day, right, there's only so many dollars in this wallet, okay, and whatever decision I made to allocate dollars to a pot to distribute, right now it's fighting between the organizations of how do I give that. Now, I think that often is a little bit different because at the margin, I think that there are ways to increase that pot. There are ways to get somebody who said like, well, I've given what I can give for the year to really make a connection. But that connection typically isn't just going to happen with a cold email.
Right. One thing I like to tell all of my clients to do, and some don't have they're not there yet when I meet them, which is why we're probably working together. Most of the clients I serve either have a zero capacity development department or a very small team. Um, and in some cases I become their team for an interim. But what I say is, let's pull out all your entire donor list and look at the patterns of giving as a group. When are donations coming in for your organization? But I like to go even deeper. Let's look at your loyal donors and let's look at their giving patterns. So if Susie Smith always gives in June, and maybe gives a little bit at year end because you've guilted her through your email campaign or whatever. It's clear that there's a reason Susie tends to give her money in June. Maybe Susie would give a little bit more if you left her alone at the and pulled that generic year end and maybe spent year end thanking her instead, or updating her or engaging her in a different way. In other words, that's one example, but there are patterns to giving that you have to be understanding and compassionate about. So, there are people who give January, February. And I've always said, why are you leaving your donors alone? Because we bug them in December. Well, don't bug them in December. Invite them if you need to in December to give, but don't be afraid of asking them for support in January and February, because
I
believe it or
think
not.
that's a critical point, because going back to what you were saying about giving in June, or about what
Sure.
I call the clutter of December, you're missing the boat there, because what you're doing, as you said, is you're kind of nagging them. All right, we need a few more dollars, right? So maybe you get 10% more, maybe you get 20% more, I don't know, just because they feel they need to give another gift because they haven't given you anything since June,
Right.
since February.
Right.
But I think that goodwill going into the year fresh would mean potentially more, because not only do I think you would get them to increase their gift, but I think that you would have other ways to engage them to bring in some of their network and some of their friends to the organization, and make a connection, because now their only feeling is sort of warmth and goodwill, because as you said, you thank them in December instead of nagging them in December. And
Roy, oh, sorry, go
it's
ahead.
challenging, right? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm chomping at the bit here. Sorry. So January, as you know, is a time period where most Americans, and I'm using America because I think this is more clear in our culture. We go into January guns blazing. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're going to, you've read all the articles about New Year's resolutions and things like that. But there's an advantage to that mindset. And here's the advantage as a fundraiser. Why not, instead of, as we just discussed, you and I, we just came up with a plan to change the landscape. You and I, we're on a mission here. Thanking the donors at year end, making them feel good so that they can tell their family and friends how great they feel. Marketing, crowdfunding. I feel so great. I did this and I just got this call and they told me this is what they were able to do. And my heart is full. And look at this picture of this person that I was able to help, or whatever it is. But in January, to sit down with that same person, particularly your major donors or your monthly contributors, and say, it's January. How would you like to support our organization this year? What does that look like for you? We noticed, Susan, that you tend to give in June. Is that a good time for you still? Because if so, I want to set you up and us and our relationship up for success. What does that look like for you this year? Then Jill, back to that car analogy, it's not, I just called her Jill and Susie, I'm naming her in different names, but that person then becomes a part of the process and they truly are a partner with your organization, as opposed to the recipient of your email or direct mail campaign. You're smiling. What's up? What are you thinking?
Well, I think it's a great point, because I think what you're talking about really comes back to the core issue in all of fundraising, which it's sitting down and having the conversation with the donor. And so many people want to, I'm not saying that they don't want to do that part, but that's hand-to-hand combat, right? That's direct interaction. That takes a lot of time. Heidi can only be sitting with Susie to have that conversation. You can't be doing that in a room of 10 or 20 or 50 people. You're having an individual conversation that's very time intensive. And I think one of the challenges is for people to understand, how can they do that while still using technology, social media, all of the other tools that allow us to spread the message wide. But you really need, for the larger gifts especially, to focus on going deep and to focus on having these intense conversations. And so there's always that dichotomy of, how do we leverage technology to be efficient? And my feeling is, and I'm interested in yours, is that's a great promotional tool. That's a great way to get out your brand and what you do. It's not a great way to ask for the money.
Well, interesting. I've got a couple things I want to say about that, but interesting statistic I just read recently, and I don't want to be misquoted, so I will have to be general in what I'm about to say, but apparently my generation, Generation X and under, anyway, older, they are still wanting that face-to-face, in-person, or at least by telephone ask. However, the younger generation, over 50% of them say, I don't care, ask me online, that's cool. I mean, do it the right way. They're not saying, randomize me, I become a number, but they're saying they're okay with that. So it's interesting how the generations are shifting a little bit. So just take note of that.
The question I have about that I think is going to be interesting to observe over the coming years and decades, is whether that's a progression. In other words, while we're young, while we're on our phones all the time, which I think all of us are now, right? Are they going to have that same comfort level when the asks of their generation are not for the $5, $25, $50, $100 gifts because they're young donors going into an organization, but they're instead for the $5,000, $10,000, $25,000 gifts that are often the lifeblood of established organizations. So as they progress up that donor timeline, right, typically in terms of maturity, not all based on age, but often there's a correlation. Are they going to be as comfortable with somebody asking them for $25,000 in a text, in a social media post, as they are with somebody asking them for $25?
Obviously, I don't know the answer. I don't have my fortune teller ball today. It's a great question, though. I
I
would,
told you
if I had
you
to
needed
guess, I would.
that for this call. I don't
I,
understand it.
it's in the repair shop. So,
It's
you know,
quant.
I think that was a question where I think you're intuitively, the answer, that it's still going to come down to the relationship. It's still, what I love about the younger generation, and they get a lot of heat, right, from people older than them in particular. But what I love about the younger generation is they are creative. They are swift in their response to things. They don't take a lot of time over processing. They are very relationship based. Now, those relationships are I think a little bit different in terms of my opinion. I've not read a paper on this or anything, but more people know more people right now because they can. The access, the online access is, my son, for example, he doesn't play it all the time. He has restrictions, but he plays Xbox, and he says my friend. And that always is interesting to me, because when it's someone whom I know that goes to a school, then I would say, yes, that's his friend. But when he mentions a person and I ask, well, who's that person? And he says, so-and-so. Well, where do they live? Not sure. They're not your friend, honey. You don't know them. You don't, but that's my generation speaking. So I guess
right. It's a different
it really
mindset. And
is.
it's interesting if you think even how a lot of us meet through business relationships or conferences or seminars. And in today's world, a lot of those conversations can happen on LinkedIn. They can happen on Twitter. They can happen everywhere else. And frankly, some of the best relationships that I've built over the last 10 plus years have started through social media. We've made a connection, then it's evolved, right? Then you meet in person at a conference or you spend time on calls like this. But relationships build different ways in today's world. So, Heidi, I know we're running out of time, and
Oh my
you've given
goodness.
us a lot
You
of
said it
great
would go by fast. I didn't believe you.
a lot of great information. So I want to see if you have any closing words, and most importantly, let people know how they can reach you if they're looking for an opportunity to get help and get support for their fundraising efforts. There's so many groups now looking to really ramp that up in this time of crisis.
There's so much more I wanted to say and so much more I wanted to share. So we'll have to do this again, Roy. I'm going to invite myself back, if that's okay. We'll see what your listeners say. They may say, "Phooey on that, don't bring her back." But, I'll say what I've said to all of my clients, whether it's this situation that we're in now, or a future environmental situation that we're in. Stay the course, and by that I mean don't do things the quote unquote normal way.
Right.
But you have got to be. You can't put your head in the sand. Be the lighthouse for your organization, and I'm speaking to you as fundraisers, you as executive directors. Be the lighthouse in the storm. And
best way to reach you, Heidi, before we have to.
Okay. All right. So greenkitefundraising.com. They can certainly reach out to me there. I have a Facebook page, Green Kite Fundraising Adventures. Look me up. I'm on
Great.
LinkedIn.
Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate all of the insight and input that you've given us, and we look forward to talking to you again. We'll have you back soon.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you.
Take care.
Roy Kessel signing off for the Sports Philanthropy Podcast.
Bye, everyone.